Welcome back, everyone, to part 11 of Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are summarizing the book by A. Leo Oppenheim. Today we are starting the History of Babylonia, part 1. We're going to talk about the difficulties in writing history in general, and particularly as it relates to the ancient Near East. We're going to look at some of the sources that are used to reconstruct the history. And then finally, we'll start with early Babylonian history, and we'll continue the series into tomorrow and perhaps the next day as well. So it's hard to write history, no question about it. There are very few quote-unquote historical texts in the Western sense of the word when we approach the sources that we have extant from the ancient Near East. So there are some texts that do refer to actual events, but they do so for other reasons than simply recording history. Even those texts that are considered historical, they are not free from intention, right? And the intention is not strictly to record history. And of course, that's so often true in history writing today, and in any period. There's always an angle, there's always a point. There are things that are put in, things that are left out, based on the historian. So, but this is necessarily true because they were not, in this period, intentionally writing history in the Western sense of the word. Royal inscriptions and literary compositions must be used with caution. We'll talk about royal inscriptions here momentarily. But anything that deals with an historical event, something that we have concluded actually took place, we still need to be very cautious because each text is doing something. And you hear me say that a lot in interviews and in discussions with people. What is that text doing? And we always have to ask that question. Quote, I think, from Oppenheim here on page 144 is appropriate. In short, nearly all these texts are as willfully unconcerned with the truth as any other historical text of the ancient Near East. So this sort of summarizes the difficulty with writing history from the period because, again, the motivation, the goal is not simply to record the events and their chronological order. Now, some of the sources that we have, and again, I'm going to go through these very quickly, but some of the chronicles, things that have information about individual events, sometimes they're laid out in more detail than others. Astronomical Diaries, so these are celestial phenomena and the event that coincided or correlated with them. And so these are, useful, particularly from a dating standpoint, because if we can identify the celestial event that is being referred to, which of course is no easy task, sometimes we can correlate that to an actual event. But again, you have to use these with extraordinary caution. King lists. So in Babylonia in the south, the majority of the period of Mesopotamian history, the years were counted or identified by year names. And we have a daily data video that cover these things, the dating in Mesopotamia. In Assyria, they used eponyms. So there were eponym lists, and the years were named after the king or his high officials. Dedicatory inscriptions, those that are left in the temple or are buried or inserted into the temple construction as dedications to the gods. These have historical value in the sense that they do note historical events or things that the king did, so we can utilize those, again, very cautiously. And finally, royal inscriptions. So we need to be very careful, though, when we come to royal inscriptions. These are inscriptions that generally speaking, that the kings wrote or kings had written. These were meant for the gods. They often described pious deeds that the king did or conquests, victorious events, battles, those sorts of things, dedications of objects, rebuilding of temples, all these things show up in royal inscriptions. We have to remember that they were not meant for general consumption. They were intended for the gods. And often these texts were written for the king himself. And so they're going to be crafted in such a way that the king would approve of them. So when we look at them for their historical value, we need to keep that in mind. Another quote, which I think is very important, page 153. In all of these instances, references to literary topoi, historical facts, and historical situations are so densely interwoven that the historian is not only faced with philological difficulties, in other words, difficulties of trying to understand what the text says from a linguistic standpoint, but also with the far more complex problems of style and literary influence as they mold and distort the report for specific purposes. Always ask yourself when you come to a text, what genre is this and what is it doing? With that in mind, in that hopeless situation, I think we can still write a good history, obviously, of Mesopotamia. We just have to be very cautious, right? So, Oppenheim's presentation of Babylonian history, followed by Assyrian history. Keep in mind that he's not going to go into exhaustive detail. He's not going to cover every aspect. As a matter of fact, Oppenheim is writing a history for specific reasons. So he's adding certain things and he's leaving certain things out, like every historian does. Just because Oppenheim doesn't mention something in his essay does not mean that it was not an historical reality, right? It just means that he left it out for a particular reason. So, there were two climaxes, he argues: Sargon in the beginning of Babylonian history, so the 24th century roughly, and Nebuchadnezzar II, 604 to 562 BCE. The best documented period, or at least an extraordinarily well-documented period, is the reign of the first dynasty of Babylon, Hammurabi and his successors. So this is the Mari period. We will get into, we've talked about this in a little bit of detail in the Mesopotamian history overview video that we did, but we will discuss the Mari period at some point in great detail. But suffice it to say here, it's a period that is very well documented, relatively speaking, and so we know an awful lot about Hammurabi and his successors, and all of the intrigue and the rulers that ruled at the same time. So, when we go back into the third millennium, we see the king Lugal-Zaggisi. He comes in at the end of what we call the Lagash dynasty. The Lagash, at the end of succession of kings of Lagash, and Lugal-Zaggisi conquers Uruk, and shortly thereafter is defeated by Sargon. And Sargon of the Sargonic dynasty, 24th century, unifies Mesopotamia in a way that had not happened previously. Political power moved away from the city of Uruk. So, the Mesopotamian south, this was a central power. If you read through the Sumerian king list, you see Uruk is a central city. And here, Oppenheim notes that political power is moving away from this Sumerian center of power. The palace organization expanded. It was supported by taxation. It was staffed with personnel who were required to give military service. So these are large organizational changes. Even more changes take place under Naram-Sin, his grandson. But nonetheless, this empire building that Sargon and his dynasty did was a a huge development in Mesopotamian history. At the end, the city that was Sargon's capital, the city of Agade or Akkad, was overrun by the Gutians, these invaders, and the Gutians brought down the city of Agade in a weakened state. The Gutians were defeated later by Utu-Hegal, the king of Uruk, circa 2112, who, under Ornamu and later Shogi, ushered in the Ur III dynasty. And the Ur III dynasty, of course, was centered at the city of Ur. And the city of Ur then reasserted control and a unifying force over Mesopotamia again. And you see there is a video that we have called the Bala system, which talks about the redistribution, taxation and redistribution system that existed in the core and the periphery of Mesopotamia. You can watch that video. I think it's very enlightening. But it was a major system, and it stayed in place for roughly 100 years. So this brings us to the end of the third millennium. And so to recap, when we pick up next in the next daily data, we'll see beginning of the second millennium and the changes that take place. But as a quick recap, writing history is hard, and we need to consider the purpose of the text and the motives of the writer. This is important in everything that we do. Sargon, at the beginning of Babylonian history, unified Mesopotamia and then was defeated. The Ur III dynasty picked up where he left off, unifying it again, and was then defeated. This pattern will continue throughout Babylonian history, and we're going to see that as we move from the third millennium into the second millennium in the next daily data. So tomorrow, Babylonian History Part 2, the reign of Hammurabi, and the crazy and chaotic time and well-documented period that was the beginning of the second millennium, the first quarter of the second millennium, and all of the interesting things that come because of it. So stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?